Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Lamar Waldron on the line with us, the author of The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination and Legacy of Secrecy and Watergate. And what am I missing here, Lamar?
Well, Watergate, The Hidden History, and then our first book, Ultimate Sacrifice.
Right. And you've got a book on Nixon, too, don't you?
Well, that was Watergate, The Hidden History, Nixon, the Mafia, and the CIA.
There you go. Okay. So we were talking about why it was that Lyndon Johnson asked Earl Warren to basically run the Warren Commission and lie. I remember sitting across from Dave Powers and having him tell me how he was trying to tell them what was going on, and Jerry Ford kept interrupting him and things like that.
Well, and people should know that when you talk to David Powers, along with Kenneth O'Donnell, were JFK's two closest aides. They were in the car directly behind JFK's limo, so they had the perfect view of the president as he was being shot and the grassy knoll. And both men, as Powers told you, and as both men told the Speaker of the House in the 1980s, Tip O'Neill, and he put it in his autobiography, they saw and heard the first shot come from the front, which is the shot that hit JFK in the hollow of his throat just below his Adam's apple. And they saw that horrible fatal headshot come from the front as well. And you're right.
And the front is the so-called grassy knoll.
Exactly right, which means conspiracy. And that's why that the Warren Commission counsel, Arlen Specter, didn't want to hear that. You know, there's a tortuous, not even testimony, but like an affidavit that David Powers did. And and they weren't the only ones. A Secret Service agent in that same limo also saw the fatal headshot from the front. And so, but again, people have to realize, that this is a cover-up, and I have to say this, done for some good reasons, but done because of the mafia's planted information. In other words,
the mafia had gamed the FBI, the Secret Service, the CIA, and LBJ, at least for a short period, and Bobby Kennedy, for that matter, thought that.
And see, that's why people have to remember, you and I were part of the cover-up, Tom. We can admit that now and talk about it, but you and I found out about, Commander Almeida and the plan for a coup in Cuba 10 days after Dallas that was never supposed to be made secret, not a year after the coup, not 10 years. Never. I mean, this is.
I mean, it was never supposed to be revealed.
Right. I'm sorry. Never. That secret's never supposed to be uncovered because the people in Cuba could never know that their leader had worked with JFK to secretly eliminate the Castro brothers, and so this was something secret beyond all imagination. LBJ didn't know about it. He finds out about it literally when he, apparently the morning after he became president, and he is shocked. So he doesn't just believe this phony information implicating Fidel and Russia and Oswald that the mafia had planted. He thinks, well, perhaps they somehow infiltrated this operation and they got Kennedy first. I mean, LBJ basically said that.
Right.
Robert Kennedy.
He thought he might be next.
Well, and not only that, but I mean, even Robert Kennedy wondered about that very thing because he was running this operation for his brother who had delegated it to him. So he even asked the head of the CIA within hours of his own brother's murder, did you do this? And Bobby focused suspicion on some people who were involved there, and he later did his own investigation. So I don't want to leave the impression that everybody knew everything right off the bat. They didn't.
Right. They thought they were saving the republic. They had to cover up who killed Kennedy because they thought it would lead back to Castro and possibly Castro and Khrushchev.
And it would start the nuclear missile.
And it would start World War III. That would be the end of civilization.
And the Warren Commission was the idea not of LBJ, not of Earl Warren, not of J. Edgar Hoover, who thought the FBI ought to do everything, but it was the idea of friends and associates of Robert Kennedy. Right. But Robert Kennedy himself, along with the CIA and the FBI, had to withhold information. As you and I were the first to discover, 4 days before Dallas, JFK was almost killed in Tampa, Florida. John and Robert Kennedy covered that information up because JFK gave him an important speech in Miami shortly after his major trip to Tampa, where he had a huge motorcade. Then he gave the speech in Miami with words the CIA had actually helped him craft, intended for Commander Almeida to reassure him that the U.S. would back him in his coup. So JFK couldn't very well cancel his Tampa motorcade or say, gee, I almost got shot in Tampa. That had to be covered up. That was covered up for years until you and I found it after going through thousands of pages of
hours and hours and hours of microfilm.
And then I called up the Tampa chief of police who said, Mr. Waldron, I've been waiting on this call since 1963. But the FBI, in coordination with the CIA, had withheld all information about the Tampa attempt from the Warren Commission, from the 4 later government committees, including the JFK Assassination Records Review Board in the 90s, created
Well, J. Edgar Hoover was being
Congress.
J. Edgar Hoover was being blackmailed by the same mobsters who killed Kennedy.
Well, he had been dealing with them since the 50s. And it's good you mentioned Hoover. We can talk about a little about, because what happened in the 50s, the mafia had the run of Cuba and America. The Eisenhower-Nixon administration, except for that one time in Phoenix City, Alabama, pretty much left the mafia alone. It was Senator John F. Kennedy and his Senate counsel brother Robert Kennedy that went after the mafia in the late 50s in a very public way. That's what launched Kennedy to the presidency. And then, right before the election, the 8-year vice president Richard Nixon ordered the mafia he ordered the CIA to hire the mafia to kill Fidel Castro right before the election, an October surprise that the experienced Nixon felt would make him look much better than the young Senator Kennedy.
Well, that time JFK was beating up Nixon because just a year and a half earlier, Castro had taken over Cuba and at first approached the United States government, and then we said no, and he went to Russia.
Well,
and so Kennedy was
Nixon
beating up Nixon for being vice president when Cuba went communist.
Right. In other words, Richard Nixon is the one who said no, who could have started a new relationship with Castro. Richard Nixon didn't do it. He preferred to have the mafia work with the CIA to kill Fidel. Now, the three of the mobsters who were involved in the plots that Nixon ordered to kill Fidel Castro before the 1960 election were Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Johnny Roselli.
The 3 guys who killed JFK.
Right. So
I mean, they didn't actually pull the trigger. None of them pulled the trigger, but they were the guys who made it happen.
They coordinated it, and they all later confessed, but you can start to see what happened. Some people say, well, did the CIA kill Kennedy? Did any Castro-Cubans do it? Did the mafia? Well, yeah, these mob bosses were all working for the CIA. In 1963, the CIA continued these plots.
Because Nixon had hired them.
Right. But the plots continued without telling JFK or Bobby after Nixon was no longer vice president, and the mobsters were able to use their work for the CIA to provide cover for killing JFK. Now, the CIA, some people realized that. The FBI was monitoring some of these mobsters under JFK because he really went hard after the mafia. So now you can start to see the many intelligence failures that the FBI and CIA and Naval Intelligence and the Secret Service were covering up back in 1963. But what do you do? I mean, imagine if after JFK was shot, somebody came out, whether it was Bobby or the Secret Service or LBJ, and said, JFK was almost killed in Tampa 4 days earlier. Well, then you can't limit the assassination to Oswald. It might lead to Russia or Cuba, thanks to the fake mafia evidence, and that could lead to World War III. So once you start covering up, and like I say, the real cover-up started under Vice President Nixon in 1960, but it continued with Tampa, and there was an attempt in Chicago 2 weeks before Tampa. Once you start covering up, these agencies don't feel like they can ever finally come clean. Now, there are people, and I really love the work the people in the FBI, that the FBI people do, the CIA people do. They do tough jobs. They have political considerations they have to follow. But, they certain longtime bureaucrats in each of those agencies need to come clean finally, instead of continuing to support these phony Castro killed JFK or Russia killed JFK stories. It's time to let all this information come out because it's been 53 years. They have Carlos Marcello in federal prison in 1985 on tape talking about aspects of the assassination. He made a full confession in front of an FBI informant and a witness. Santo Trafficante, he confessed in 87, but the FBI has files from December of 63, where Trafficante talks specifically about the payoffs for the assassinations with his attorney at that time in December 63, Frank Regano.
Who
we
we
don't
know.
have those files. We just have a reference to them.
Right, right. Yeah, and there was a point at which, right after you and I discovered the name of the number 3 guy in Cuba, Almeida.
Well, I think it's Almeida. I'm
Almeida.
great with history.
We mispronounced it for a long time.
Languages are not my strong suit.
Yeah,
so
and I came to D.C. and I talked to one of the guys in charge of security, and he basically threatened me with prison for the rest of my life if I ever mentioned that name out loud, and pointed out that this was still a secret operation. This guy was still inside the Cuban government. He was still an American asset. You know, he was still in a position to take over if the Castro brothers were to die or be assassinated. And I was about to blow this deal. And so we had to basically fictionalize this guy in the first book in Unequal Protection, or Ultimate Sacrifice. And, you know, eventually he died, so we named him in Legacy of Secrecy. But is that operation still considered top secret?
Well,
is that what's going on?
So.
Is that why the bureaucrats aren't speaking?
Apparently so. In other words, even though Commander Almeida died years ago, several years ago, and you're right, you and I had to cover that up for more than a decade, and I had to cast a lot of, you know, sort of warranted, some not, suspicion toward Che Guevara, of all people, in the first edition of Ultimate Sacrifice, which is, by the way, people should always buy the trade paperback editions of our books because they have all the extra stuff we had to leave out of the hardbacks. And so, yes, you're right. Almost the entire JFK Almeida coup plan file is still secret to this day. The files on the people we interviewed, you and I interviewed between us 24 people who worked with John and Robert Kennedy on aspects of the coup plan, these attempts like in Tampa. Almost all of that information is secret. Some files had slipped through. That's how you and I know about this. We interviewed the people who actually worked on these plans, or worked like the chief of police in Tampa to keep JFK alive. Various files had slipped through, so we know that massive amounts of other files exist. The National Archives says about 50,000 pages in the form of 3,000 documents are yet to be released and will be released this fall. But NBC News reported back in 1998 that there were 1 million CIA files alone, not pages, files. And as for the FBI, we can talk now about, we'll tell your listeners, there's a secret file room the FBI has had in Washington for years. And whenever Congress has asked for files or other agencies, it's totally unclear if the FBI just searches their regular files or if they go to the special file room in Washington where apparently some of these unreleased files may reside. And the FBI even has a secret warehouse in Maryland where when the special file room in Washington is too full of special secrets, they get shipped off to this warehouse in Maryland. We don't know if those files have ever been searched. There are so many crucial FBI files, like all those wiretaps of Carlos Marcello in federal prison, Johnny Roselli's many meetings with Jack Ruby in Miami shortly before the assassination, while Roselli was under FBI surveillance. So many of these things. So this is why when there is a new hearing, confirmation hearing, for the new FBI director, the nominee, we have to find some way to get even one senator to say, look, will you obey the law? Will you look in your special file room in Washington for these unreleased files? Will you have someone go to that warehouse in Maryland and look for the files there? And there are more files, too, that the FBI...
Why so much conventional wisdom? I mean, as you pointed out, there was just this History Channel special. There's been a bunch of others, Oliver Stone's piece, et cetera. Everybody say, oh, it was the CIA, or the CIA, had it done, or it was,
shadowy general.
Yeah, it's when it was, prior to the election of Jack Kennedy, there'd never been more than, 30 prosecutions of the mob in any one given year by any administration? And Jack Kennedy initiated something like 700 prosecutions in the first year. I mean, it shouldn't be rocket science that the mob was seriously pissed off at him.
Well, and they no longer had Cuba to go back to. And more importantly, Kennedy had banned the mafia from this coup plan or from reopening their mob casinos in Cuba if the coup plan succeeded. So the mob had nothing to gain by letting the coup plan go forward. They had everything to gain by using this incredible secrecy around the coup plan, which, like I say, even the vice president didn't know about until after he became president, to use as the cover for their killing of JFK. I mean, and you and I can talk about some of the ways the mob infiltrated this top-secret coup plan. One of the people we interviewed who worked closely with John and Robert Kennedy, a Cuban exile by the name of Harry Williams, very famous hero of the Bay of Pigs, the man who helped to get the Bay of Pigs prisoners out of Cuba, working with his best friend in 1963, Robert Kennedy. I should say late 62 and early and throughout 63. And Harry Williams told us a man by the name of Bernard Barker worked for Santo Trafficante, as he later learned, while he was working on the top-secret coup plan. Now, who was Bernard Barker? Some of your listeners will say, well, that name's vaguely familiar. Well, he was the assistant the CIA assigned to E. Howard Hunt when Nixon's plan to use the mafia to kill Fidel in 1960 began.
And he was also one of the Watergate burglars.
Exactly right.
Yeah, still with Nixon. We'll be back with more Lamar Waldron right after this.